Jesus, Lamb of God. Worthy is his name. When Benu was talking about grace, it reminded me, we bought a couple American dolls for our granddaughters, and their names were Grace. And when we bought these dolls, I thought, only in America. Only in America could you charge what they charge for an American doll, and people buy it. I thought I would never buy an American doll, but we bought two named Grace, gave them to our granddaughters. And the youngest one, Sophie, instinctively called her Amazing Grace. And so she was there saying to her sister, "Look, Caitlin, Amazing Grace has this. Look, Amazing Grace has this." And after about the fourth or fifth time of her referring to Grace as Amazing Grace, Caitlin had enough. She couldn't take it anymore. She said, "Sophie, it's only Grace." And I thought she's right. It's only Grace, but it is amazing. And I thought how cool it is that Sophie instinctively put amazing and grace together as if they were one word and they were joined together. Because it is amazing and it is all grace. When I had a Geo Prism that I bought twice. I bought this Geo Prism as our main car, and then in time it became our second car. And then our son took it to college, and Carol and I did with one car for that period of time. When we moved to Huntington, it became apparent that we would need a second car. And at that time, our son was graduating from college, and, well, as a college graduate, he couldn't be driving that Geo any longer. And so he wanted to buy a new car. And so rather than trade in the Geo for this new car, I said, "I'll buy that Geo back from you." So I bought it again so he'd have down payment money on a new car, and I drove the Geo. I liked the Geo. It had electric windows, electric doors, shut the doors, and it would lock. It was red, sort of. You know how red gets faded after a while? Well, but it had issues. It had some issues, and the issues grew as time went on. And one of the issues, when you would sometimes put the key in the ignition and try to turn it, it wouldn't turn. And if the ignition didn't turn, the windows didn't open, the doors didn't open, and the car didn't turn on. So one hot July afternoon, you know, a car's been sitting closed up, good part of a hot day, you get into it, it's kind of stifling. Well, I got into the Geo, shut the doors, they locked, and it was stifling hot in the car. I turned the ignition and nothing. And I thought, uh-oh, the doors are locked, the windows are up, I'm in a hot car on a hot July afternoon. I know what happens to people on hot cars on hot July afternoons. They die. So I immediately was desperate. I mean, I was in panic mode. I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Even if somebody should happen to walk by, they can't open the doors because they're locked. They can't wind down the windows because they're up. What are they going to do? I thought, I'm going to have to break a window. And so I kind of turned in my seat, pulled my knees back to my chin, and I was ready to lunge at that passenger window with all the force that I could muster and break that window so that I could have air, so that I could breathe and I could live. And then as I did that, and I pulled my legs back and I was ready to lunge forward, I saw my release. And I thought, how stupid. There it was, in the upper corner of the door panel, that little latch that you flick up to open the door. So I quietly pulled my legs in, sat back around, hoping no one sees. Flipped that little latch, opened that door, and I was free. I could breathe. I wasn't going to die on that particular day. But in that moment, when I thought I was trapped in that car, I was desperate. I was in panic mode. Today we're going to look at a scripture where two people on the same day come to Jesus, and they're both desperate. They're in panic mode. One is Jairus, the synagogue leader. He's at the top of the social ladder. And then there's a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, and she's impure and unclean, and she's on the bottom rung of the social ladder. It was an important story in the life of the early church. We know that because both Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the story. And we know that from the length of the story, the amount of space given to this story. We're going to read and look at Mark's account of this story, found in Mark chapter 5, starting with verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that the power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you asked, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. You will be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, and the brother of James. Then they came to the house of the synagogue leader. Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him. He put them out. He told the child's father and mother and disciples who were with them, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means "little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. It was an amazing day in the life of Jesus. He comes from the other side of the lake. The other side was the Gentile side. He had just healed Legion. He comes back onto the Jewish side of the lake. And his reputation had been growing, so a crowd immediately gathers around Jesus. And Jairus, the synagogue leader, who is desperate. Jairus is desperate. He comes to Jesus. And he doesn't look Jesus face to face, but he falls on his knees. And he pleads with Jesus. The love of his life, his beloved little girl, is dying. And Jairus can do nothing. Jesus is his last hope, his only hope. Jairus is desperate. He pleads with Jesus, "Come, touch my daughter that she might live." And you could see Jesus. You could see and sense the compassion in him. I sense Jesus reaching down and picking Jairus up and saying, "Let's go." So they move off and begin to walk towards Jairus' house. And the whole crowd follows. There's this great procession leading to Jairus' house. People are all around, gathering and more coming as they move to Jairus' house. And then Jesus stops. In the middle of the procession, he stops. And he said, "Who touched me? Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples look at him and said, "Jesus, look around you. There are hundreds of people touching you. What do you mean, who touched me?" And Jesus said, "No, the power left me. Someone touched me in faith and was healed." And he looks around the crowd, and there in the crowd is the woman who touched him. And she was desperate. She had bleeding for 12 years. For 12 years she had been suffering. 12 years she went to the doctors and it only got worse. She spent all that she had. She was poor. She was isolated. She was ceremonially impure. She was not able to attend the synagogue functions. She touched anyone and they would become impure and have to go through cleansing rites. If she was married when the bleeding began, she was probably now divorced. If she was single when it began, she still was single. She was desperate. She was alone. She was isolated. Jesus was her last hope, her only hope. And there she is in the crowd. And she comes and she has confidence in Jesus because she knows, she's heard about Jesus and his reputation, that he's a teacher of the law, but a teacher with a heart, that he's a man of compassion and mercy, that Jesus lives out what Hosea had said about God. "I desire mercy and not sacrifice." On several occasions, Jesus challenged the religious leaders and said, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." So she knows of Jesus. She's heard of a reputation that he touches the lepers and heals the sinful woman and has a tax collector as one of his disciples. He understands that there is no one who is beyond his touch. But what is she to do? He's on his way to Jairus' house. Who is she to stop this procession? Who is she to come before Jesus in this midst? If those around knew that she was there, they would expel her, kick her out, throw her away, because her presence would make them unclean too. And so she sneaks around and weaves her way into the crowd, thinking, if only I could touch the tassels, the hem of his garment, then I would be healed. And she sneaks through the crowd. She touches Jesus. And she knows instinctively, she feels the power. She feels that the healing has come to her. And so does Jesus. And he stops. And he says, "Who touched me?" And there she is in the crowd. She's caught. She had risked it all, and now she's caught. She comes before Jesus, and just like Jairus, she falls on her knees, but not to ask for help, but to ask for forgiveness. And Jesus stops, and he listens to her story. She tells the whole story. And there is Jairus. He's waiting. Every minute, every second is counting. His little girl lies dying. And Jesus stops and listens to this woman. And Jairus is forced to stand and wait. And then she tells her story, and he addresses her with tenderness. He says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And as he's talking, as he's listening to this woman's story, what Jairus fears the most happens. Word comes to him from his servants that his little girl has died. And they say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. It's too late." And you can see Jesus. He leans over. He whispers to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe." Those words, "don't be afraid," they appear a lot in the New Testament. Jesus tells his disciples on the lake when the storm is up, "Don't be afraid." He says, the angels tell Mary and the angels tell the shepherds, don't be afraid. That's one of those, Andy Stanley calls it, Jesus is not commandments. Do not be afraid. So he leans over and he says, don't be afraid, just believe. And then they begin to move towards Jairus' house. Outside of his house are a lot of people. They're wailing and crying and weeping. Jairus is an important person in town, and so there's a lot of wailing and weeping on his behalf. And Jesus sends him out of the house. He goes into the little girl with just Jairus and his wife and his three main disciples, Peter, James, and John. He touches the girl and she gets up. And he tells everyone to be quiet. Don't tell anybody. Keep this a secret. That day in the life of Jesus was an important day in the life of the community, in the life of the early church, because it reminded the church of three things about Jesus and us. That Jesus had that power to heal. Not only did he have the power to heal, but he had the will and the desire to heal everyone and anyone. That there was no one who was outside of the range of his touch, of his healing hand. And it reminded people again and again that we are desperate for his touch, desperate for his presence. In a minute, we're going to sing a Michael W. Smith song called Breathe. And we're going to sing it as we remain seated, kind of as a prayer. And there's one line that's in the song that says, I am desperate for you, desperate for your touch, for your presence. And that's what I want us to key on in that moment of prayer, to remind ourselves again how desperate we are for God's presence and for his touch. And then during the offertory, Lydia is going to sing another song for us, a Laura Dangle song called Trust in You. When I was thinking about this passage and I was thinking about Jairus and the woman and what might have happened to them after this day, I thought, it would be easy for Jairus to trust Jesus in the future. It would be easy for the woman to trust Jesus in the future. But what if? What if the bleeding didn't stop? And what if his little girl didn't rise from that bed? Could Jairus still trust him? Could the woman still trust him? In this song by Laura Dangle, one of the chorus, it goes, when you don't move the mountains, when you don't part the waters, when you don't hear my cries, I will trust you. I will trust you. And so as she sings, Lydia sings that during the offertory, it's an opportunity then for us again to affirm that, Lord, no matter what comes, I want to trust you. I want to trust you in the good. I want to trust you in the bad. I want to trust you because you have the power and the presence. Laura Dangle is one of my favorite singers in these days. After Lydia sang her song, How Can It Be, a few months ago, I bought her CD, and I really like this CD. We traveled to Baltimore 3 weekends in a row. It's about a 6.5, 7-hour trip. So on the first weekend, we listened to the CD all the way up. And when we came home, we listened to it all the way home. Same CD. Second weekend, we listened to it all the way up to Baltimore, 6.5, 7 hours. We listened to it all the way home, 6 and 7 hours. Third weekend, we listened to the same CD, the same 11 songs, all the way up, all the way back. Halfway back, Carol said to me, I've had enough. We got to listen to something else. I bought the CD. I made a copy of it. I have it in both cars. I can listen to it on my computer. I only need to buy a CD every 3 or 4 years. I just keep listening to the same one. But now I want us to take a moment and come before God in a moment of prayer as we sing Michael W. Smith, Breathe, and really focus on those lines that I am desperate for you. And then after we sing our prayer, we'll engage in the pastoral prayer.